Hello, testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Hello, everyone. Good to see you all this morning.
Hello, Prof.
Ready?
Good morning.
Welcome. Oh, let me grab my soda. Need a little bit of caffeine to keep this day going. On Friday, we are going to have a special guest come and talk with you guys. Dr. Temuka Chijisiku, he's originally from Zimbabwe. Actually, he's going to come and just spend the hour chatting with you guys. He did his undergraduate here at Claflin University. He worked actually in my lab doing protein design and protein work and some directed evolution. And then he went on to one of the best labs in the world, or probably the best lab in the world for doing protein design. That's where he got his PhD. He got the cover of Nature and Science for the first de novo designed proteins. If anybody's interested, I can send you a couple of the papers that he's done. And since then, he's gone to work for Novartis Pharmaceuticals, and he's a senior scientist there, doing drug design and protein design. He's coming to Claflin just to speak to our students, and we're starting a project together in my lab. But he's a great person to talk to because he's made the transition from undergrad to graduate school to we're getting some feedback somewhere, to working in the biotechnology field, doing lots of really cool stuff. And so he'll just, chat with you about it. He can, for those of you who are in Africa, he's got a lot to say about that whole transition. He's actually hosted 2 conferences in Africa because he's trying to grow technology on the continent. I think he did both of those in Zimbabwe. He's got a huge social media presence. He's all about helping students get into biotech, stay connected to biotech, form a community of biotech folks. So, and he's a dynamic and fun speaker. So hopefully on Friday, you guys will have a chance to ask plenty of questions. Please ask lots of questions. Get his contact info. I can always share that stuff out, but he's kind of like my protege, one of my students that have gone on and done some awesome things. And if you're interested, I will send you, shoot me a little chat or an email and I'll send you his papers. If you're interested in reading them before you meet with him on Friday. So cool. Before I get into today's talk, and maybe folks will need to remind me about this later on. Where's my chat? Where's chat? Notes, apps. Oh, here we go. Let's see. Hold on just a second. I can actually. I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat. Here's one paper. I think these are 2 different papers. Okay. Those are 2 of his papers that I think you may find really interesting. Certainly all of the stuff that's in those papers, if you start reading it and you have no idea what half of it means, when you have me for Genetic Engineering 2 next semester, you're going to learn all that stuff. So by the end of that course, every word in there should make sense to you, if it doesn't already. Um, let's see. In addition to that, we do have a new flip up. I still am missing a few videos from Flip on the effects of climate change. I'm going to start grading them right away. So if you haven't sent them in, I'm sorry, or send them in right away. I'd hate for your grade to suffer. And I want to see what you have to say. But there is a new Flip. I'm putting in the link into the chat. So if you click on that and bookmark it, and this one is actually going back a few chapters to what we've talked about earlier. I believe, let's see, these chapters were this was when we were on lecture 13 through 15, carbon cycling. So these are about the carbon cycles. So it's stuff you already know. I want you to teach it. Imagine you're trying to teach this to students that have either don't know about it or really didn't understand when I gave a lecture. You want to start including pictures, not just, talking. So you want to have diagrams, however you want to make that. But in Flip, you should be able to upload diagrams and make them part of your presentation and stuff. And if you have a hard time doing that, you can go to the help on Flip, or you can email me and I can send you the links for the help on Flip so you can see how to do those. But at this stage, you guys should be getting good enough at Flip to be able to make some really neat presentations. Okay. Any questions before we get started on, or before we pick up where we left off? Okay, well, then we're gonna go. Okay, let's see, share. There we go. That's a screen that you don't want. Let's see. Trying to think where we left off was, sorry. Why can't I find the right one? Okay, so last time we were talking about responses to climate change and how we're going to respond to this huge problem. And there were 3 levels that I mentioned about possible responses to climate change. Those were adaptation, mitigation, and geoengineering. We talked quite a lot about adaptation. We're just about to get into mitigation, and we were starting to talk about the differences. So remember, adaptation, that is defined as making changes that allow us to live with the effects of climate change, okay? To adapt ourselves, the stuff around us, so we can survive climate change effects. Mitigation is primarily to fight climate change and make it go away, usually by removing greenhouse gases, since those are what's causing climate change. So trying to lower CO2 amounts, etc. And then finally, geoengineering is actually changing our planet. So climate change isn't as bad, or the temperature doesn't rise. But it's important to understand the difference between adaptation and mitigation, because it seemed from last time there was a little bit of confusion. So most biotechnology is going to really be a form of adaptation. Okay, so changing a plant so it can survive a drought or survive heat stress, that's just adapting. You're not changing the amount of CO2 in the air. You're just changing, these food crops so they can survive in areas which wouldn't survive otherwise. So remember, as CO2 increases, you also see an increase in photosynthesis. So, it's less about, oh, these droughts are decreasing photosynthesis. and it's more about these droughts are stopping us from being able to have food. We have pretty big problems ahead of us. So if you look at Africa, these are some of the projections for Africa based on RCP 8.5, um, which is probably like around SSP 3. So this is today, and the red shading shows areas of drought. The more red it is, the more drought you get. By 2030, we see a lot more heavy drought in parts of the continent, and by 2050, severe areas of drought. Okay, so this is the red is the share of the decade spent in drought. So if you're in deep red, that means 90% of those 10 years, 9 out of those 10 years are going to be in drought. Whereas if you're in places like, this light shaded area, that's about 1 year of drought every 10 years. And so these are the projections for 2030, 2050. So drought is going to be a huge concern. We expect to see a lot of increases in food insecurity. For example, we project a drop in cereal productivity. These are, cereal crops, and you see the biggest drop along the Sahelian line over here. That's an area that's generally pretty dry, and it's going to get drier. And once you have a drop in productivity, remember that also, because of the laws of supply and demand, increase the prices. So we expect about a 30% rise in price by 2050 for most foods and cereals, the cheapest foods, which is unfortunate. Again, we're talking about the idea that climate change, many of its effects are going to be borne on the backs of those who have the least amount of affluence. But besides changing plants, we talked about limiting pests and invasive species, when we talked about the armyworm, right? Again, that's not changing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, so it's a form of adaptation. And in fact, there's a lot of areas in here to consider, not just invasive species, but also because of these high drought areas. A lot of times you have to move the crops after they're grown into storage facilities. And because of the increases in humidity that we expect in climate change, because remember, as the temperature rises, the air can hold more moisture. We would expect more fungal infections, more pests. And again, here's another target for biotechnology. But again, it doesn't change the amount of CO2. But food is a big concern. So it turns out that as you increase CO2, you actually have effects on plants in terms of their protein production. So if you look at cereal and forage crops, those show lower protein concentrations produced when CO2 levels have been increased. So protein can go down by as much as 10%, and some other nutritional aspects tend to go down if you're in high CO2 conditions. And so as CO2 increases, we're probably going to need to adapt our food, right, to make this stuff, more healthy, to combat the effects of climate change that we're seeing. In addition, higher CO2 has been shown to reduce the zinc content of crops. And so here is showing leaves grown under different CO2 concentrations, and this one is showing a severe zinc deficiency here in the highest CO2. And the projections are that by 2050, over 175 million more people than now could have zinc deficiencies in their diet, which is going to make them more susceptible to illness. It's going to cause cancer. And so that's certainly a big, big, big problem. In fact, if you look at projections of zinc deficiencies worldwide, you're going to see they're going to be largest in Africa. So Africa is going to be hit really, really bad with that. But again, this is something that's targetable by biotechnology, but it's just an adaptation. So we've got changing plants, working to fight pests, increasing nutritional content. We talked last time about strengthening food webs, like by doing genetic engineering with coral reefs so they can withstand lower pHs and ocean acidification. What we didn't talk a lot about was making vaccines. So one of the effects that we expect is that climate change is going to exacerbate diseases. Um, uh, so here's this is from an article in Nature, where I got a couple clippings from, and it's showing the number of diseases that are expected to be affected by each one of these climate change related effects. So rising temperatures is going to make worse at least 150 diseases that have been identified. Rainfall and floods, another 100 each. Droughts, storms, land changes in land use will also increase diseases. Sea level rise really won't do much, but we do have a big worry as Antarctica and many of these permafrosts start to melt. There's a lot of organisms that may still be frozen in there and may still be viable. So it's very possible that diseases that haven't been, you know, active on Earth for like 100 million years may come back to start biting us because they've been thawed and they're viable because they've just been frozen. Modes of transmission are totally expected to change with emerging diseases, both for waterborne, airborne, and especially vector-borne. As the climate changes and you get more regions which, increase in temperature, many of the species that act as vectors can now move into new territories. And so you're going to have a lot of commotion. Um, uh, and again, here's a link to another article on that. I'm trying now to include links to articles. So when you have the PowerPoints, if you find a particular topic that really interests you, and maybe that's the direction you want to go in biotechnology for fighting climate change, start by getting some of these initial articles, read the article, and then look at the table of references and get some of those articles. And that will kind of help you on your progression um, to investigate that particular topic. But climate change is going to really have a lot of different effects on emerging diseases. And here's just a whole kind of slew of those things. So in terms of adaptation, what can we do? We talked about the role of governments and how governments can play a big role in adaptation. And so that's one essential thing they can do is to build an infrastructure to respond to these emerging diseases. We had a trial run through with COVID-19, right? And we did horribly. And so the idea is for the next big pandemic, for the next big disease that starts to spread, are we going to be ready for it? Do we have a rapid response? Can we identify it? Can we then sequence the DNA or RNA? Can we track the disease? Using that information, can we create vaccines? Can we create therapeutics? I actually have two students that have since graduated and gotten PhDs and working in creating vaccines, and another one that works in therapeutics. And you'll have a course in emerging diseases later on, I think in 2 semesters, that will cover all of this in detail. And we'll talk about vaccine creation next semester in the protein structure course. So these are all adaptations, right? Because they don't change CO2 level at all. And all of these adaptations, remember, adaptations cost money. This is always going to be a big thing. You want to do any of this research, you need to get money to do the research, right? To buy all the equipment and all that kind of stuff, pay your salary and stuff. And so since adaptation costs money, we really have to think about affluence and who should bear the brunt of the responsibility of paying for these things. Okay. And we talked about when we went through a couple different graphs that in the initial stages, the rich world will probably be okay up until 2050, a little bit less. And then depending on our climate trajectory, nobody's going to be okay. But it's not fair to leave everybody else out in the dirt, right? Okay, so that's adaptation. Well, now we want to go specifically on mitigation. Remember, these are policies to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. Okay, this allows us to avoid warming and all the things that come with it. And ideally, you want to design things so you bring emissions of greenhouse gases to zero. And so let's see, that brings us to this one. We're still in chapter 11. We're still talking about adaptation, mitigation, and geoengineering. We've covered what adaptation is. We've covered the idea behind mitigation and the differences between the two. Now, to dive into mitigation, if we're talking about future policies, remember our goal is to bring greenhouse gases down to zero. And we have a relation that tells us a little bit about that. This is the IPAT relation. This is the expanded IPAT relation before. And remember, the I stands for impact, or the amount of emissions, okay? And the units are going to be in like tons of carbon dioxide, right? Population and people, affluence and GDP per person, energy intensity. And we'll go through each one of these, as well as carbon intensity. We'll go through each one of these in turn. And remember, our idea is to bring emissions down to zero, because we can't keep putting stuff up there. So first we start with population. Okay, really there are no plans to reduce population to zero, because in any mathematical term like this, if you bring any one of these down to zero, you'll get zero, right? Because 0 times anything is 0. So decreasing these numbers are all great, but nobody really has any plans to decrease population or bring it to zero. We care about climate change because we care about people. And so that isn't something we want to do. It should be noted, though, if our population doesn't grow as much, we wouldn't be on as high of a trajectory. And we know that population tends to increase less if you're more affluent. So there's a relationship between those two. But we're not trying to lower population. We're also not trying to lower affluence, right? There's no plan to reduce that to zero. There'd be a lot of moral issues if we said, okay, well, these people can't use anything, products or services, because every product or service out there requires some energy to do or produce. And it just wouldn't be politically viable. You wouldn't have people running for office saying, I'm going to give you less. When my policies to go through, you will have nothing and you will be able to do nothing and the climate will be great. No, they don't have that, because you do need to buy food. So that leaves these last two terms. The first one is energy intensity. Remember, that's the efficiency of the thing that you're using, and how much energy it uses to do its thing, right? So there are different kind of light bulbs. You can get the old-fashioned incandescent light bulbs. You know, we talked about those early on when we were talking about power generation. Those are terribly inefficient because in order to produce the visible light, they have to go to a really, really high temperature. But remember, that visible light is only a tiny sliver of the black body radiation curve. And so most of the energy being put out by that light bulb is in the form of infrared, even though you don't see it. And that's in the form of heat. And so all that energy is lost. But if you go to Diodes, or the newer types of LED light bulbs, those only emit at the specific energy of visible light. It's not emitting like a black body. It's using a quantum mechanical phenomenon, and so it only emits light in the visible range, and so you don't have all that energy loss. So we know there are ways to increase our energy efficiency and decrease the energy intensity, right? We're making, you know, um, rules on gas mileage for cars, right? There's a lot of fuel efficiency standards, and those have been increasing every year. Um, Hopefully, they will continue to do that. That's making our cars more fuel efficient, so they go the same amount of miles, but on less fuel. And so that's decreasing the energy intensity. Um, it doesn't appear, however, though, that we can make it go to zero. Nothing can be perfectly efficient. It's always going to take some amount of energy. But we can make some gains in energy intensity, but we'd never be able to bring it to zero. It's just not possible through physics and through engineering. So that leaves us with the carbon intensity, right? And carbon intensity, remember, that represents the technology that we're using to generate the energy, right? It's expressed in how much CO2 is produced per joule of energy. So it's really looking at how much carbon are we producing for each unit of energy, for each joule of energy. Different technologies will have different values, okay? Some technologies have very high values. Some technologies have zero carbon intensity. They don't emit any CO2. And so that's the only term on this list that we could actually bring to zero. And then it would multiply all these other things by zero. And so the emissions could be zero. And so we need to look at what are these carbon intensive technologies. We already know these. We've talked about them. There are fossil fuels, right? Coal has a very large carbon intensity, probably one of the worst. Then oil and natural gas. Currently, these make up 81% of our energy generation. So that's a lot, right? Um, what we need to do is look at non-fossil fuels. So these are fuels with zero carbon intensity. Okay, I often call them climate safe fuels. So they're divided into two categories: renewables versus non-renewable renewables. But all of these have zero carbon intensity. Okay. Renewables make up about 14% of our current energy production, with most of it coming from hydroelectric. Okay. Most of it's coming from hydroelectric. Only a few percent right now are coming from solar and wind, although lately that's been increasing a little bit, but not by large margins yet. And they're called renewables because they never run out, right? You're always going to have solar energy. You're always going to have wind. You're always going to have biomass and hydroelectric. You're always going to have rivers and stuff. And geothermal is getting its energy from the planet. I'm going to go through each one of these a little bit more in detail, but I do want to talk about the difference between renewables and non-renewables. Um, uh, Nuclear energy, which takes up about maybe 5% of our energy production, it's considered non-renewable because the amount it's these plants are fueled by uranium, and uranium can run out. So it is a finite amount of stuff that we've got for that energy that eventually we will run out with. And there's a variety of different problems that folks have with nuclear energy. There is the danger of a meltdown and spreading lots of radioactivity into an area. We've seen that with Chernobyl. We've seen that with Fukushima. Um, Not a good thing. Then there's always the issue of nuclear waste. That's got to go somewhere, right? It's got to usually be buried in the ground. And most people don't want to buried near them. So you get what we call the NIMBY phenomenon, which is not in my backyard. So people are all for the, oh yeah, let's get, power from nuclear because it's cheap. But I don't want the nuclear reactor near me, and I don't want the waste near me. Well, everybody says that, there's nowhere to put it. Then there's carbon capture and sequestration. So in this one, it's considered a non-renewable because you're still burning the fossil fuel. You're still burning the coal, the oil, or the natural gas. You're just, once you burn it, you use the energy, but you're capturing the CO2 before it gets in the atmosphere and sequestering it, putting it away somewhere. If you don't know what the word sequester means, it means to hide away or bury away or keep away from everything else. And so in that phenomenon, you actually burn fossil fuels, but you just, grab onto the CO2 and hide it. Don't let it get into the atmosphere. Again, it's a non-renewable because eventually we're going to run out of fossil fuels. It's going to happen. So these are our climate safe or zero carbon energy sources. I think one of the ones that folks like the most are solar and wind, right? Everybody seems to like that. Get our energy from the sun, the wind blowing, turbines generating. Our ex-president, Donald Trump, seems to think that wind turbines cause cancer and harms whales. There's stuff out there. I'm not even going to touch those because they're stupid. But it's, you hear all kinds of things. Both solar and wind have demonstrated ability to generate power at large scale. So you can build these huge wind farms and these huge solar farms, and they generate lots of energy. And the prices are pretty comparable with fossil fuels, so long, at least right now, this is with subsidies. So the government is giving a lot of tax breaks to build the wind farms and the solar farms and subsidies for them. So they can be competitive with the energies from fossil fuel. Because remember, if your energy source is more expensive than the coal or the gas, people are going to pick coal and gas because they don't have enough money and they want to do whatever's cheaper. So you want to make sure that the price for their energy is equivalent, and then they're more likely to make the safe choice. But the main problem with solar and wind is intermittency. The sun isn't always out. Sometimes it's cloudy. Sun isn't out at night. That's a problem for solar. In terms of wind, wind doesn't always blow. It's intermittent. And so that problem of intermittency means that we need to be able to store the energy that's produced and be able to hold it for a while, right? And so basically have batteries. And battery technology is being developed right now. That's been over the last 8 years. People have been trying to build better and better batteries for more efficient storage. Tesla was working on a really has moved the ball forward with a new battery they have for their electric vehicles, etc. But still, the technology has to move further along before it's not so expensive, because the cost of the batteries right now are just too high. Energy storage ends up being an issue in terms of cost. Also, there's problems with the fact that batteries, especially the new advanced batteries, need certain elements that aren't in wide supply, some rare earths. And so there's limitations in their availability, which drives up the price. And some of the metals in these batteries are not good for the environment. They're not good for you. So they can lead to pollution, etc. But if we want to have solar and wind as part of our solution for climate change, these are things that need to be addressed. We're going to have to overcome these hurdles. The other issue is energy transmission, right? So if you got your wind farm over here and you want that to be, where the wind is blowing, but you have people that live way over there. You need to get the energy from point A to point B, and so that requires a lot of infrastructure. And building a lot of infrastructure isn't something that affluent nations or affluent non-affluent states, have a lot of money to do so. But the more transmission you have, the better you'll do with intermittency, because the wind might not be blowing over there, but it might be blowing somewhere else. And if you have good transmission, you'll be able to ameliorate some of the intermittency problems. Hydroelectric power. So hydroelectric works, you've got a river, you dam it up, you open the dam a little bit, let the water go through. The water going through turns the turbine. And when you turn a turbine, if you got magnets on the turbine and electrical wires around the magnets, that will generate electricity. And so that's how hydroelectric power works. And hydroelectric power has been on the rise to a certain extent. China, the biggest one in the world right now is in China, the Three Gorges Dam, which generates about 22.5 gigawatts. And the Baitan, which was just finished not too long ago, I think last year, that's at about 16 gigawatts, and it's expected to reduce coal consumption by about 19.7 megatons per year. So that's a lot. They're reliable, they work well, but our ability to build more of them is really quite limited, because there are only so many rivers in the world, and most of them have already been dammed up, okay? Especially the big ones. So there's not a lot more capacity to build hydroelectric power. A little bit, but not much. So that brings us to geothermal. Geothermal is a great way to get energy. Again, it's carbon neutral or carbon zero. Here you've got, if you dig into the ground where there's a heated region in the ground due to geothermal pockets, etc., that will heat up water. And so you'll drill down, you'll pump up the hot water. The hot water will turn your turbine and generate your electricity. And then you can pump that water back, which gives pressure so you can push more water up. And so this is a conventional geothermal plant. These are great, but they're limited to areas that have geothermal activity, like places with volcanoes or easily accessible geothermal heat reservoirs. And that's just not a lot of places on Earth. So as cool as geothermal is, we have limitations on where we can put it. Any questions so far on any of these? Feel free to chime in if you got anything. Next one would be biomass. So the idea here is you grow a tree, you cut down the tree and the wood, you burn the wood for your energy, and that's how you get your energy. Does this sound like a good safe carbon neutral way to produce energy? I see a lot of head shaking no. Why is it not? This is my favorite. This is my favorite.
I would assume it's, of course, it's not as bad as coal burning, but it's still the burning of a carbon source, with it being wood or, well, in this case wood, but biomass in particular. It's it may be a little better than burning coal, but
right, you
it's
don't know
probably not a
what
stark enough
you don't know
difference.
what the carbon intensity is in terms of how many joules per CO2 that you put out, right? Anybody else have anything to say on this one? that doesn't agree with Caldrian and thinks that this is a great solution? Oh, really? No one? Okay, well, great, because that's why we have this course, right? So when you burn this stuff, what happens? When you burn this wood?
CO2 goes to the atmosphere.
Yeah, you generate the CO2, right? Oh, that seems bad, right? Well, if I got a biomass plant, I'm going to run my biomass plant. And so I got a little garden out back with all the trees that I'm growing. I cut down all my trees and burn them. That releases a bunch of CO2s, right? But now if I want to keep in the business, I have to grow more trees. Where do those trees come from that I grow? Where's all that wood come from? That comes from the CO2 in the air, right? The photosynthesis, right? All that mass of that wood, all that carbon in the wood was pulled out of the atmosphere through CO2. And so if I take biomass, I take as much carbon out of the air to grow that biomass as I put back into the air when I burn that biomass. So actually, this is carbon neutral because you had to take out the same amount of carbon out of the air that you're going to put back in when you burn it, right? You got to think of over a little time span, but this would have to be a continuous process. We're not talking about let's cut down all the trees on the planet and then burn them. That would be stupid, right? But what if there's stuff you can grow relatively fast that you could then burn for energy? It releases the CO2, but then you got to grow more of it. And so you take the same amount of CO2 that you just put in the atmosphere to make new plants. That's biofuels. That's biomass. And it can be as simple as burning wood, but usually when we talk about biomass, we talk about biofuels, which has to do with the plant sugars. So if you think of the burning of the fossil fuels, you're right in thinking, it's the same equation. We had fossil fuels, which came from rocks. You light a fire, it combines with oxygen to make CO2, water, and a lot of energy. And that's what's killing our planet, right? But yeah, that's coming from the rocks. For biofuels, now we're talking about taking from the plants. We're not taking from the rock reservoir. Remember, that's the problem. The carbon in the rock reservoir has been down there for hundreds of millions of years, right? And then we're pulling it out really fast. So the net amount of carbon up in the atmosphere, and remember the exchange between the atmosphere and the land biosphere happens fairly quickly, right? And about 4 years, right? Dwell time in between the two. And so here we're taking the same carbon stuff, only now from plants that aren't in the rock reservoir, doing the same chemical reaction, lighting a fire, burning, combining with O2, making carbon dioxide, and getting our energy out of it. But these plants were grown specifically for the purpose. So the idea is you grow plants taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, you process the plants to make fuel, use the fuel in your car, burn that fuel, generating the CO2, which you're then going to use to grow plants. And so, yes, question.
Yes, Prof. I'm just curious, like how many hectares of the crops will we be planting in order to get the biofuel?
Well, are you talking about planting like redwood trees that take 1,000 years to grow? Or are you talking about growing algae? Algae is a plant, right? So the way fuels work is let's see. 1 second, dismiss all. Oh, we're getting close to the end. This is all fun stuff. So with plants, when you have plants, you produce these sugars, okay? That's what makes up a plant, right? Like the wood of a plant and the leaves of a plant, those are all sugars, right? Now, if it's the cell walls and the plant walls and stuff like that, we're talking about cellulose and hemicellulose, which is these are just glucose molecules, right? If we were talking about the fruit in a plant, those would be kept as glucose or maybe fructose or disaccharides, etc. Um, and those that we eat, but they're all glucose molecules. And so what you do with the glucose molecules is you put them into a fermenter, okay? So you take the plant matter, you chop it up into little pieces, so it's just glucose molecules. So you got a bunch of sugar. And then you put the sugar into a fermenter with various enzymes, usually yeast. You know, think of how you make beer, right? You put some kind of plant material into a fermenter that's got sugars. You add yeast. What does that create? It creates an alcohol, right? So if it's a 2-carbon uh, product, then you're talking ethanol. We can use ethanol. Matter of fact, we use ethanol in at the gas station. In the U.S., there's a law, 10% of all the gas in the gas tank is ethanol. But you can even make higher carbon biofuels like propanol. Let's see, where's my list here? I got out of track here. So we got so you've got your bioreactor where you stick your algae in. You're going to break down those sugars into simple sugars, and then you're going to ferment those to either ethanol, propanol, or butanol. Butanol is a 4-carbon sugar. You could a 4-carbon alcohol. You can put that directly into your gas tank of a regular car, and a car can run on butanol, just like it can run on octane. And so here you're growing algae, taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, breaking it down into its sugars, fermenting the sugars, and making a fuel. Burning the fuel, putting the CO2 back in the atmosphere, but then you're going to take it out again. So it becomes net carbon neutral. You take as much out as you put in. Now, some folks are trying to do this with algae. There's a group that's playing with Wolfia australiana, which is commonly called duckweed. This is one of the fastest growing plants known. Grows really, really fast. It has half the number of genes that control the light and dark cycles. Remember, we talked about those in photosynthesis. Light cycles is where you get the energy from photosynthesis, and dark cycles are when you use that energy to fix carbon. So they're looking at growing this as a crop because it's incredibly fast growing. Another one of my favorites is biofuel from kelp. So kelp grows at about 18 inches per day, which means you can practically sit there and watch it grow. And they do lots of carbon fixation. Since these are grown in the ocean, it's getting its carbon from the carbon dioxide dissolved in the water, which causes deacidification and kind of helps with our ocean acidification problem. Okay. And you can build these large farms. There's a few folks working on a few companies, they're new companies that are trying to build these huge kelp farms for creating biofuels where they have, so this is the ocean, they have these long ropes attached to buoys, and they have these kelp plants dangling from them and growing. And then when the kelp is long enough, they pull in the rope, they harvest the kelp, put it in their reactor, break it down, and then try to ferment it into a biofuel, which you can then burn. The advantage of this is we could use existing combustion engines but with adapted for use with biofuels. So you don't really need to worry about developing battery technology. Interesting side note. Another place, bamboo. Now, it was funny because I did a lot of research on that. There's a ton of plants which they say this is the fastest growing plant in the world. So I'm not really sure who wins the world record, but bamboo is also considered a very fast growing plant. It can grow up to 1 meter a day, which means you got to be able to sit there and see it growing, I guess. I don't know. It's crazy. Here's an article for the researchers that are using bamboo to convert to fuel. Okay. Oh, that was out. Here's my other picture for kelp. This is how folks were doing the kelp thing. I gotta move this around so it's in the right place. Let's see. So bamboo is another option for doing that. And what we're talking about here is biofuels from different crops. You know, the first crops that were used, and especially the ones that were used in the US, were like corn crops. That's where ethanol comes from. It's usually the fermentation of corn crops. Anybody know why that's a really bad idea, or why it turned out to be a really bad idea?
Um,
What else do you do with corn?
well, you eat it, but
You eat it, right? It's a food stuff, right? And so if you start taking the supply and say you're going to, take a lot of cornfields and make biofuels out of them, well, if there's a limited supply of corn, what's that going to do to the price? It's going to drive it up. So it can drive up the cost of foods, right? And so because if you make an amount of corn, you can either use it for energy production or for eating. You can't use it for both. You can't have your cake and eat it too. And so if only so much is produced, it tends to put upward pressure on prices of food. And so our first generation crops were all food crops because that's what we knew how to grow and what we knew how to ferment. Now what we're trying to do is to look at biofuels made from crops that we can't eat. So we're talking about lignocellulosic biofuels. And I guess we'll have to talk about this next time because we're already past time. But there's a bunch of different things that we can't eat, like we can't eat wood, right? We can't eat wheat straw. There's a lot of plant matter out there that we're unable to eat because that plant matter is made out of cellulose, which are glucose molecules, but they're joined together in a certain way. And we'll go over the biochemistry of this a little bit on Monday, and we'll continue on talking about it. But think about, what I want to leave you thinking about is think about this. Think about that carbon cycle and that burning these trees or plants isn't as bad as you think, because if you're going to do this as an industry, that means you have to be able to grow up the plant as fast as you're consuming them, right? So you'll have to have huge farms growing up all these plants, which is taking a ton of CO2 out of the atmosphere. Yes, you're going to put it back in, so it's not carbon negative, but it's not carbon positive either. It's carbon neutral. It's sustainable. It doesn't fight climate change, right? Because it doesn't bring down the overall amount, unless we grow more than we burn, right? So there is a way to tip the scale. If we create more photosynthesis than we actually consume, if we make plastics out of some of these sugars rather than making energy, then we have a net CO2. We can talk about all this next Monday. But remember, on Friday, we're going to have our guest speaker. Please come. I think you will find him very interesting to talk to. And I will see you then.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks a lot, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay, Prof.
All right, thank you, Prof.
Thank you.